Welcome to the Brie Pod. I'm here with Niles, School Counselor and Prevention Educator.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be on here today. I really appreciate Brianna reaching out so we can talk a little bit more about some exciting things that I've done throughout my journey and what I'm currently doing.
Oh, I'm so happy that you joined me today on this episode. As you know, we've known each other for many years now, really, because we're from the same town. So I wanted you to share with our listeners who may not know you, who is Niles?
Great. That's such a great question. I really like this is really great to talk about a little bit about my role and what I've done. So like I said, Brianna and I have known each other for a long time. Our families have been friends for years, and so I've known Brianna quite a bit, and like from our town as well. And so I think the biggest thing that when I think about background is that the big thing is about home roots. And that was something that I really discovered throughout my journey, is that how much I do appreciate the North Country and being back home. And so that's a big part of what I love. But when I think about some of the unique experiences that I've had growing up in the North Country, some of them have been some challenges, but some really great challenges that I was able to overcome as well. So I graduated in 2015, and then after from Bresham Mawira, and after that I went to St. Lawrence University for my bachelor's, and that was really great because when I first went to St. Lawrence, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an advocate. I knew I wanted to help people. My intentions were actually going into law. That's what I really wanted to do. But then after I kind of doing some internships, and then studying abroad in London, and then doing a lot of advocacy work over there, and then advocacy work within our communities, I really discovered that I wanted to help children and really wanted to help our communities of how we can promote a safe and inclusive space for everyone. So a lot of my background that I've had was that when I was at St. Lawrence, I did a lot of within the community there. I helped out a lot in different kind of organizations throughout campus, but a lot of just like St. Lawrence or just like Brushton, St. Lawrence, that community is very, very important too. It's very like that home, that kind of root kind of community as well. So that's what really, from growing up, I've always seen like my parents with advocacy. That was something that really inspired me into that kind of journey. So when I actually went to London, I actually did, so when I did my study abroad, I actually did I did a volunteer internship at Stonewall, which is the biggest LGBTQ plus nonprofit in Europe. And so that was so cool to have that experience and to actually like dive deep into the work of advocacy and really focusing around LGBTQ plus issues. I identify in the community, I identify as gay, but to see the experiences within the communities and to see other identities and like gender identities and sexual identities was just truly amazing. And it was really what sparked me about the idea of being an ally and allyship. So really focusing on how can, even in a big city like London, there was still, we wanted to still be promoting that safe, inclusive climate and that environment for everyone, because we all deserve that at the end of the day. So really, that's what really focused my journey into advocacy. Once I got done that, I graduated from St. Lawrence in the class of, actually just in December 2018, I graduated, but I was technically the class of 2019. And so I when I got out there, I got a job at Planned Parenthood, and that's where I did a lot of my advocacy. So I worked, like I said, I worked through Planned Parenthood, but what was unique position when I worked at Planned Parenthood was that I was the sexual assault prevention educator. And so I worked for sexual assault services. And that's what's really unique about our Planned Parenthood in the North Country. We also have a sexual assault service agency for Clinton, Franklin, and Essex counties. And so that was a lot of my experience. And so I would go across, I worked there for about 2 years and 8 months. And so I went across the communities, across Franklin, Clinton, and Essex counties, primarily K through 12, and educated around sexual assault prevention education. And a lot of those topics really included around child sexual abuse prevention, healthy relationships, and how can we have a healthy relationship? Because so many of us, I think, often we don't experience healthy relationships, and so I think every day having these conversations about prevention education and how we can make sure everyone has a safe and healthy and inclusive environment is so important. And so that was a lot of some of the background that I've done in that position as well. I also, when I was there, I did a lot of groups as well within the community, primarily for teens, and how, again, opening up the area to build a really safe, inclusive environment for teens across the North Country. So that was a lot of kind of my role that got me into kind of that spark of advocacy. And then after that, I recently just got a new position. I am now a school counselor at a middle school in our area, and so in the North Country. And so I kind of been taking all that experience that I've had, like with my advocacy journey, and helping students across the North Country, but primarily it's 5 through 8. So I'm in the middle school counselor. So a lot of the topics, what I've recognized with especially healthy relationships, sexual assault prevention, harassment, bullying prevention, followed me to my current journey as well. I would say every single day I have some kind of unique kind of situation that a student is experiencing. And it comes a lot of times around their social emotional well-being and their health. And a lot of these topics can come up as well. So that's a lot of my role and my background of who I am. But I always, like I said, I really like to just focus on a lot of times the little things. I think that's really important, really to cherish and embrace those things. Because throughout our journey in life, there can be a lot of ups and downs. And so I think just ride it out. I think that's the biggest thing that I think when I think about who I am, is just really riding the wave. So embracing that journey for sure.
Well, I need to start off by saying, first and foremost, congratulations on your new job. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Um,
I appreciate that.
yeah, knowing you personally, it's just so inspiring to know just how far you've gone. And I didn't even realize, I mean, I do remember that you went to London, but I didn't even realize that had occurred for like I'm just so happy for you that you were able to have such a passion and make change overseas as well. That's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about when I do think about that journey, that is just to think about, just even like I said, that big city, like thinking those issues are so common in every community as well. And that's something that I've recognized in my current work as well. It's just, it was larger scale, but there's the same kind of systemic issues that that happen in our world. And so when we think about, especially around prevention education, especially promoting that safe and inclusive space. We're doing that every day so we can make sure that we can do the best and advocate for people. So that is something that I recognized over when I was overseas and then came back home, is that a lot of these issues are they're worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you bring up safe, the term safe, because recently I had a podcast episode from my own personal episodes talking about safety and how safety is so important. And we don't even realize how important it is to feel safe, and that we don't need to, and we should not have to feel that we're on, eggshells in our life. So I'm very happy that there are programs and role models and mentors and people out there that are helping create that safe environment because it's so needed.
Absolutely. And I think that's the biggest thing that sometimes we, like you said, that we forget to take for granted. Like when we don't feel safe, of how that really affects our mental health and our well-being, but also physically as well. So it's really important when we just think about safety, of how really important it is for one to feel safe.
Absolutely. And because this month we are diving deep into domestic violence awareness, I want to bring that in on from your perspective. How important is safety when it comes to being either a survivor of abuse or potentially a victim of abuse?
Yeah, I think that is like the biggest thing when we do think about in any kind. Like I said, a lot of my background has been prior was into sexual violence prevention. But now in my current role as a counselor and throughout my advocacy, when we do think about relationships in general, right? When we think about the word relationship, we oftentimes think about dating relationships, but that's not necessarily the case. We have a lot of interpersonal kind of relationships that we go through every single day. So a lot of times it's peers. When I'm seeing that with school, when conflict happens, how do we um, make sure that everyone is safe involved? How do we safely intervene if we see kind of violence taking place? So that's a huge thing, is when we think about the different kind of relationships we have, it really varies of kind of the idea with violence. And so when we think about from a survivor and a victim kind of approach, of how we can promote that, is really validating someone when they are going through their experience and their journey. Because especially when we think about violence and abuse, that's often because of a power and control struggle. And when we do see that kind of situation happening and escalate, we don't want it to get to that escalation where it does become domestic violence or some sexual violence, because we can prevent that at the end of the day. And by promoting, like I said, that safe, inclusive environment and space is really important for people.
I really appreciate you bringing up that there are other forms of relationships, because a lot of times when you think of domestic violence, I think some people strictly go to the idea and sexual abuse of violence that it's just your partner. But unfortunately, with both, it could be an adult in your life. It could be, your parent who's abusive. It could be anyone. It's not just like the person that you're dating. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it can, even with mental abuse, that can be an environment that is unhealthy for yourself as well.
Absolutely. And that's when we think about violence, there's so many different kind of I like to say like kind of webs from violence, because there's physical violence, right? There's where it could be actually like kicking, shoving, any kind of that kind of physical nature. But there's also emotional and mental violence as well. I mean, when we think about the idea of gaslighting or um, manipulation, those kind of tactics, that can be very unhealthy as well, which could lead into sexual violence and domestic violence. And when we think about those systemic issues, and there's a lot of emotional violence. There's financial violence. There's a lot of different kind. When we just think about the word violence, there's a lot of different umbrellas that happen,
Absolutely.
and who can be affected. Because at the end of the day, when we think about domestic violence or sexual violence, or like I said, any kind of violence, we're all affected by it. And that is each and every day throughout our communities and throughout our schools or through that. That's why it's so important building that safe and positive climate through schools.
Yes, especially through schools because the biggest term I can really come up or not come up with, but bring up is bullying within the schools. And now that we have social media, it's so much easier for bullying for students.
Absolutely. That is one of the biggest, I will say, coming into this profession, and like I said, I've been only in my new position for a month, and I would say every single day we're noticing definitely increases in harassment or getting into preventing harassment, I shouldn't say, but just in general of conflict and how the conflict can escalate and how it's continuing and repeating. And it can be a lot of bullying that can happen. So that is definitely when I do think about just even from my previous work too, it just it happens a lot each and every day. I think it does, and especially like you said, with the rise of cyberbullying is huge, especially when we think on like social media apps like TikTok or Snapchat is another one, Facebook, Instagram. We can see a lot of those. We can see each and every day of how um, sometimes how people are treating one another.
Absolutely. I know that it's even scarier when Snapchat had, and I don't know if they still have this feature, but they had the feature where they could make messages anonymous and send them through. And I know that's actually most platforms could allow that as well. Um, but it is almost, I want to say, in a good way to hear that at the schools that there are uh, prevention measures being made in order to help diffuse um, potentially that bully or maybe find why that person is bullying or how to help the person being bullied. So very thankful for you in that position.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the biggest factor of why what's happening is when we think about stress. And that is the biggest thing. I think peer pressure, stress, and other factors and stressors that are happening. And oftentimes that's why bullying or any kind of violence kind of happens. Is like when we think about when someone's feeling stressed out, maybe their defense mechanism is um, to act out into that kind of to that getting into the kind of violence as well. So, like I said, we can really prevent that at the end of the day, and that's when we do think about, especially situations with violence for sure.
So I did want to, I appreciate you sharing that because I do believe that that is so true, especially with COVID making our environments, I think, a bit smaller, or I should say our community a bit smaller with person to person interactions. I feel like the rise of domestic violence went higher when we weren't able to go out and people were not able to leave their houses and had to work from home. Um, but I wanted to add to that. So earlier we had discussed power and control. What is your take on that with sexual violence and domestic violence?
Yeah. So when we think about power and control, that is probably we think about at the end of the day, this kind of idea of power. And so when we do think about the really great way to describe it is there's actually, if you definitely look it up, when we think about especially the idea of violence and how it happens, it's the best way to look at it is the power and control wheel. That is a really great way of how it shows how it can escalate to violence. And so when we think about kind of those kind of when we think about the different kind of abuse or violence. So when we think about physical violence, what is physical violence? What is emotional violence? What is sexual violence? What is domestic violence? Right? It kind of shows how when we have those keep on repeated patterns that are happening, and what kind of examples that look like, and how it can create, if it continues, of how it can escalate to violence. And so that's when I think about power and control, that is a really great way to kind of understand the tactics of what people who are committing and acting on the idea of violence, to how they can gain that power and control over the victim and survivor. So that's when we think about the idea about power and control.
I actually appreciate you sharing that because I've never really heard of the power control wheel, but I'll have to add that link to this episode.
Absolutely. Yeah. Love is Respect is a really great organization. One Love Foundation is really great. It really taught, I used a lot of their resources when I was a prevention educator. They have really great videos, really great ways to show about kind of those warning signs in your relationship. And to, so it doesn't, and when we kind of see these signs, and how it doesn't, so it doesn't escalate to some kind of to violence, and domestic, especially domestic violence and sexual violence. Because my biggest thing is that I always wanted to make sure, to let people know this, that no relationship is perfect. No one, right? Where none of us are perfect, but we can strive to have healthier relationships. And so we want to make sure so it doesn't end up getting to escalate to that violence as well. So that's a huge thing when we do think about, because not every relationship, that's a big piece that I want people to know. Not every relationship might have domestic violence or sexual violence, but that's why it made me recognize why it's so important teaching young to, lifespan, about recognizing and talking about those warning signs in relationships, because that can help de-escalate this situation, and making sure that there isn't that kind of power and control struggle.
Definitely. I do want to touch base a little bit on the aftermath of a violent relationship, just because there's a lot of like almost falsehoods or like myths out there where either the survivor or victim, believe that they could have done something differently, or and then what I mean by this is that a lot of times they feel, that had they done something a certain way, they wouldn't have been hit. But what I have learned from researching so deeply into domestic violence awareness is that a lot of times with the abuser, it, like you said, it's that it led up to that point. Like it didn't just start where they hit you, it led up to that. So I wonder what your take is on that aftermath and falsehood.
Absolutely. And I think that, like I said, everyone processes and when it differently. So when we think about that's trauma that when we think about, especially with if you are a victim and survivor and living in a relationship that was unsafe and led to some kind of domestic violence or sexual violence, that there's many kind of different stages that the aftermath that one goes through. And I think that's like you said, I think when you said a lot of times, especially um, when we think about victims and survivors, oftentimes a lot of times they blame themselves and blame themselves because of the violence that they'll be like, oh, I can't believe I let that happen to myself. But I think what's hard is when we get invested into relationships, it can be really hard to notice those signs as well. And oftentimes if one is able to get out of that relationship, they're able to kind of recognize afterwards about some of the things that happened. And so that's where I really think the stages of recovery are really important, especially when we think what is appropriate for that person in the moment. And that's why really thinking about um, the idea of establishing safety is really important, because we think about that power and control for someone that has experienced sexual violence and domestic violence was taken away from them. It's gone. And so their whole life, they really have to reshape their whole life. And so, really thinking about establishing safety, having that safety network again. How do they feel? How can one feel present again and feel safe every day? And how, again, when we think about like reconnecting, how can we get back and be able to reconnect with others? And so I think that when we think about those kind of when we do think about violence, it's kind of it's an everlasting thing that we of how we can overcome that. And that's why establishing and having safety networks and knowing and trying to establish that safety and having that support can be really important, because that can help build resiliency at the end of the day. And especially when we think about these situations, it's so important. So many of these people who have experienced this are so resilient, because it is truly, I'm sure, one of the hardest things they probably have had to do and deal with in their life.
Absolutely. And I'm thankful for you for sharing that, because it's so true that um, from my perspective as a survivor, feeling safe again, because at first I thought I could never feel safe ever. But then, I went and got the help of my therapist, and I have a better relationship with not with that person, but with a person that respects me and values and loves me. But I'd love for you to share especially since you work with school age children, what advice would you give to parents that maybe they could share with their children to find your program to help with that safety that you guys are able to provide?
Wow, yeah, that's a great. I appreciate you asking. First of all, I appreciate you being very. Thank you for sharing your experience, and that's really vulnerable, and that takes a lot of strength and courage to talk about. So kudos to you for doing your work. That's and really working through those kind of barriers and those struggles that you've been through, because that's not easy. So and I'm sure it's not easy. So that's you're really strong and resilient for going and seeking out and getting the support so so you can feel safe again. So I just wanted to touch base on that real quick as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. But then when we think about showing and having these signs, and how can parents and caregivers, um, how they can help with prevention, because at the end of the day, that is so important. And especially when we think about children, they're at home with their parents and caregivers. And I think the biggest thing that I would say is listening to your child, listening to their needs and to their wants, and having conversations with them about what kind of things, what are they experiencing at school? How is their school environment? What are what who are their friends? What are those everyday kind of things we that we kind of communication and those social skills, because that is so important of how we can help build that resiliency in children. And parents and caregivers, you're not going to know all the answers either, and that's okay. But I think the biggest is how can we meet our child, and I'm sure how can parents and caregivers meet their child in the middle. So, and I think it's really listening to them, communicating with them in an age appropriate way, but knowing that you got their back and that you support them. And I think that's the biggest value and key as well right there. And knowing that if they need help and they need support, really reaching out to your local community agencies that can help as well, because they have these resources where they can help their child as well.
I'm glad that you shared that because from I think it's so important that there is, I want to say the term of validation of if you're listening to your child, or even from the other aspect of an adult saying, "Hey, this happened," or you know, if you start that communication early and that they know that they can trust and speak with you, I think that's so important because, like you said, our main goal is prevention. And if they're able to reach out, because the biggest thing about any abuser, regardless of how the relationship is with you, is that they want to isolate you, and they don't want, and they will make sure that they're a chameleon where they won't show their true colors in front of the public eye. So I think it's so important that if we start young with being able to validate, and a lot of people I feel think that's weak for validation, but I think it's so important that they're known, that they're heard and seen, because then they're more apt to maybe prevent something before it even gets to that place, you know?
Absolutely. I think that's like you hit it right spot on. It's like the validation is key. I think that is the most important thing when we think is to validate your child, or just when we think about people in general, just really validating them and listening to them is really important as well. And I think a lot of it is when we think about feelings and emotions, as learning of how can we offer those kind of tools, but how can we help, especially when we think about children, how can we help them regulate those emotions and those feelings, especially if they are experiencing these kind of huge, big systemic issues like violence? How can we, um, how can we help them cope through these times as well?
Absolutely. I feel like with you saying that, it's that whole, it goes back to like you were saying with prevention that, you know, I feel like a lot of times with abusers that do go further than where they should, they maybe they weren't even allowed to feel when they were younger. Because I know that there's a lot of people that believe, feelings again goes back to that weakness, are not okay. But I think it's important to feel and help them work with those feelings, because in the future it could be beneficial to their future friendships and partnerships, and help continue with that prevention.
Absolutely. And I think, that's a huge thing that I've recognized as a school counselor too. A lot, yes, we're here for counseling and helping students, but we also do it when we're in the classrooms, and when we think about this climate for school, we're we really want to help for that prevention, but creating that safe environment for all students, because that's so important when we think about when conflict arises and violence happens.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your perspective, because I think it's so important. I think that we don't realize how important it is to start at basically, I want to say almost the beginning in a way, because we can shape our children's and future children's futures this way by recognizing and helping them. I'm so thankful, because I feel like, especially counselors at school, I feel like they don't get enough credit for how important and valued you are all for students. And I personally appreciate the counselor I had back in school, because they really help you not only make an impression on your life, but feel seen and valued. So thank you for your service and your help.
Well, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm sure all the counselors, we appreciate hearing that as well. But we, like I said, we're here to. That's what our jobs. That's what we're here, and that's what got us into our kind of field. Is that we want to see the best out of children, and we want to make sure that they're heard, they're seen, and that they get the best support ever, and that they're feeling safe and throughout their environment.
Yes. Oh, so I did want to ask you before you go a couple of things. Number one, um, where can either our followers either find you, or what organization would you like to share with our followers?
Yeah, I think the best one is so I have a LinkedIn profile. So it's under Nathan Niles. So you can go there and so yes, and that's a really great way if you want to connect, or if you have questions. That's a really great way as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And then my final question for you is, as you may know, at the end of each episode, I love sharing an affirmation. And lately, I've been having our guests share their personal affirmation that gets them through. So I would love for you, if you're willing, to share an affirmation that means a lot to you.
I think I have two that I really like to talk about.
Oh,
I
yes.
think, yeah. So one I think is embrace the journey. I think that's a huge thing. So I got that I have a tattoo on my ankle that has that. It's with a wave above it, and it says embrace the journey. And I think that's so important, because when we do think about that kind of symbolic of like a wave, right? Or in our journey in life, it's kind of this circle, but it just keeps there's going to be times where it's smooth, there's times that's going to be bumpy, but how we can manage and get through it is really important, and how we can get through our everyday life, especially when we are thrown those kind of obstacles or barriers as well. And then the other one that I like to is give yourself some grace. I think that's the biggest thing, especially what we're going through right now. I think this is it's a very unprecedented time as well, and I think there's so many factors as well that's happening, and people are feeling stressed every day. There's a lot of new mental health and emotional and well-being, and so that's, I think, giving yourself some grace right now, and how you can get through it is the biggest thing.
I love both of those, especially the symbolism with the wave. That really ties that together so well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Um, well, with that, you are loved, you are worthy, you are cherished, and I am proud of you. Until next time on the Brie Pod. Bye.
All right. Thank you so much.